Public Power Underground is sponsored by the Energy Authority. The energy transition is upon us, and if there's one company who has public power's back, it's the Energy Authority. TEA isn't just any sponsor of the show, they're the backbone of what we stand for, keeping the power in the hands of the people. With offices in Bellevue, Washington, and Jacksonville, Florida, TEA has coast-to-coast expertise in energy trading, RTO management, portfolio management, advanced analytics, renewable energy, and much more. As the energy industry evolves, so does TEA, staying on the cutting edge of technology to help their 75-plus public power clients maximize the value of their assets. When you partner with TEA, you're not just keeping up, you're leading the charge. Learn more at teainc.org. That's teainc.org for more.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without end.
I'm Paul Dockery, Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light and an energy industry practitioner. I'm joined by Crystal Ball, the Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee. Hello, Crystal.
Hello, Paul.
Glad to have you. We're also joined by Katherine Blunt. Hi, Katherine.
Hey.
Katherine covers renewable energy and utilities for the Wall Street Journal. Her team's reporting on PG&E has been honored with a Bartlett Steele Award for Business Investigative Journalism, the Thomas L. Stokes Award for Energy and Environmental Reporting, and was named as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Katherine is the author of the book California Burning: The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and What It Means for America's Power Grid. So I put together, because I knew we were coming and because this is a great history of the sector as seen through one utility's perspective. But as Crystal Ball put together an analogy for the electric sector that it's evolving like the eras of Taylor Swift, we decided this was the perfect chance to walk from an era of the electric sector into an era in Taylor Swift's album and discography. I don't know, one of those words. And then we're going to talk about Pacific Gas and Electric within that context and what was going on there and make it all fun and do this in like 25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes. So I think I'll start if that sounds like, does this sound fun to you, Katherine?
Sounds fun to me.
Are you a Swiftie, or are you at least, you're familiar with Swift if nothing else?
I don't think I've graduated Swiftie status, but I do appreciate some Taylor Swift for sure.
Okay, that's perfect. That's the right level here. I did put together a playlist for this based on how I'm going to walk through this.
Excellent.
So I walked through my understanding, the way I thought about the electric sector in the various eras of the electric sector. And Crystal, you can tell me if you think we should just map them directly from the beginning or if we should go through this narratively. But if you go to like slide 3, I'll describe what I view as the eras of the electric sector. Love to get your take on this, Katherine. My first era I called the Insul era.
Yep.
The second era is electrification era. And the electrification, yeah, that's because it's Willie Wirehands. And what's the other one? What's the not cooperative one?
Ready Kilowatt.
Ready Kilowatt. It's a nice mashup. And I'm going to walk through like the milestones as we go, but somewhere around 3 Mile Island, we get in the energy crisis in 1970s, we transitioned to the efficiency era, which is the era of the cardigan. And then I went to the deregulation era, which was this era in the 90s and aughts where we were doing a lot of restructuring. And I understand it's not deregulation, it is restructuring. I'll get talked to about that, but that's how I think it's a good name for it. And then the era that you do a really good job in the book of discussing, the power crisis era, which is this era of the California 2001 power crisis, but also the Northeast blackouts. And what was that, like 2003? It's in the deck somewhere.
Yes.
And then the energy independence era, where we're investing heavily in our own renewable energy, sector, but also we get the fracking revolution and shale gas revolution. And then one of my hypotheses, which we'll get to at the end, is that we're transitioning to a global area. That is both global warming having a huge impact on electric sector, but also the linkage with liquefied natural gas to the global energy market means the electric sector is subject to the whims of the global energy sector.
Mm.
So that's my hypothesis. We're going to start from the beginning. If you go to slide 5, I want to talk about what was happening at Pacific Gas and Electric during what I call the Insul era.
Mm.
The Insul era starting with the War of the Currents and ending, in my view, with the Public Utility Holding Act of 1935.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us what's going on at Pacific Gas and Electric, Jan?
Yeah. So Pacific Gas and Electric, which it was at that time, it didn't. PG&E is now the holding company, but the utility is Pacific Gas and Electric, and it goes back more than 100 years. And this was like doing this research was like really fun. It was like a really dynamic, kind of even romantic time, and as like companies in California were competing to supply power, specifically because there's such a vast hydro resource. So some of the first generating facilities were powerhouses built along the rivers flowing out of the Sierra, and so PG&E was early to recognize that value. PG&E sort of started as I guess it was San Francisco based from the outset, but it was like it resulted from the acquisition of a bunch of little tiny companies to create Pacific Gas and Electric in 1905. But it only ever had one real competitor, which was a company called Great Western Power. Really, frankly, one of my favorite historical power companies. Started by these two really like different but equally scrappy guys who didn't really know what they were doing, but like somehow managed to build this really, really valuable hydroelectric system anchored by Lake Almanor, which is not too far from Mount Lassen, Northern California. It's a big man-made lake made by flooding part of a river basin. I guess I forget the name of the valley. Great Meadows was the name of the valley, and so the two companies competed pretty fiercely for a while, even as there was increasing consolidation and regulation in the industry until they finally merged in 1930, which created the great Northern California monopoly that we know today, being PG&E, but also it created some issues that would take a really long time to come to the fore. But PG&E acquired this massive hydro system, a lot of it which is super remote and hard to access. And the company just sort of let it age, frankly, over time. And part of that original Great Western system failed and started the campfire. The lines, not to get too far ahead, but it broke a little tiny hook on a transmission tower that was hung in 19 something early on, broke in half because it had been swinging there for 100 years. So totally interesting history, lots of interesting players. For anyone who likes that kind of stuff, I hope this chapter's interesting, because it was really kind of hard to pull the info, but it was like a lot of fun too.
I had fun reading it. I like how you describe it as romantic.
Yeah, there's some romanticism, venture, pioneering spirits for sure.
Yeah.
And the tie, and you talk about telegraph later issues that arise, but it's this massive deployment of infrastructure phase in the industry. And you do talk later about like how all the records were lost. And I think there is a lesson to learn there around when you're deploying and building a bunch, you actually have to make sure you keep your documentation, because that really matters later. And it does, I think later on, you kind of talk about how it's in some ways lost this Great Western Power Company's documents were effectively hard to find.
Absolutely. And like, while on the one hand, you can appreciate the challenge of keeping records for 100 years, but for as long as you're going to have those assets in operation, you should have something that tells you about where it came from, even if it's not original documentation, but to like go out and figure out where it came from, right? That was a big question for PG&E after the failure of the tower. It was like, what is this? And they were like, we're not quite sure.
What is it? What is it made of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What is it made of?
Where did it come from?
Yeah.
What's it made of?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. So I mapped this to it seemed like natural, mapping it to the self-titled Taylor Swift album that came out in 2006. It was her Western album. Picture to Burn I think Picture to Burn did a good job of like articulating the competition of this era. And kind of the competition of the War of the Currents. You got to go up a couple slides to slide 4. Crystal. And I had it closing out with our song, which I think is a good anthem for the Public Utility Holding Act of
There you go.
1935. Any take
Yeah.
there, Catherine? Are you taking me on this
Oh
analogy?
yeah, I absolutely think that's a good match.
Great.
Perfect. So if you go back to slide 6, Crystal, the next era I think is the fearless era. That's how I mapped it. Starting out with the love story, "You Belong with Me," the perfect anthem for the Rural Electrification Act, and we were happy being a great like closer to this era, talking about like we were happy, but mapping to what is a fairly sad event of the 3 Mile Island accident. But ending and capping this fearless album. What was going on at Pacific Gas Electric? Do you like this album for this period? And then what do you
I think so.
What was
I think
going
so.
on at Pacific
I mean,
Gas?
so I mean, obviously you're seeing we're talking here about a couple of very Rural Electrification Acts, awesome, very specific, but like PG&E was elsewhere in territories that are already being served by privately held utilities. I mean, there's this great need for expansion after World War II, right? And PG&E invested more than $1 billion in the system in those, not current dollars, $1 billion back in 1950s terms, and did this huge build out to make sure that all these new homes that were increasingly electrified, had enough power, and it got an industry award. There you go, 1952, a Charles Coffin Award for the most ambitious expansion that the industry had seen at that time. And it continues to try to build. And one of the biggest undertakings in the wake of that was to it embarked on building the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. And like many other nukes that we've seen, it was massively massive cost and time overruns. It ended up being like a real problem as it related to what they were going to, whether they were going to be able to kind of rate base what it then looked like a pretty expensive boondoggle. Same with San Onofre, which was a Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric collaboration. And it kind of played into the dynamics that ultimately led to the conversations about deregulation or restructuring, as we'll get into. But so it was like really, really massive, rapid growth, innovation, experimentation that kind of came to a halt in the 90s as we saw rates very high relative to the rest of the country.
It's a good segue because the next era, I call it the efficiency era, and from my perspective, it does like start with the oil embargo. I got some coaching from my daughter that The Last Great American Dynasty should be the song that I mapped to the oil embargo, and I should include Jimmy Carter's sweater speech, which is a 1977 speech, to map to Cardigan. That felt better. I think that felt better. But I'm actually really curious. I didn't grab much from what was going on at Pacific Gas and Electric during this era. You talk about Diablo Canyon, which I do have on the timeline. But can you talk about what the efficiency era was like for them? And because this whole industry was kind of buckling down, or I don't know the right word for it.
Yeah, so I think there was 2 questions that came out of the oil crisis, right? Which was like, how can we produce more electricity domestically, for one, and like how can we use less of it? So there was certainly, I think, efficiency gains made throughout the industry. But for PG&E specifically, that was, I guess, part, like many other utilities, this idea of like, okay, well, why don't we build these huge nuclear plants then? Which, like, not only are we producing electricity, well, we always produce electricity domestically. I shouldn't have said that, but like, how do we become more independent from these oil exporting states? Because at the time, a lot of power plants ran on oil. And so that was part of the problem as when supplies became scarce. So instead, like, why don't we build these nuclear plants? Because it's insulated from the sort of market swings that were so challenging, or like, the whims of other countries in production. And so there was all kinds of like legislation passed trying to spur the build out of plants that ran on other things. And as it relates to so for PG&E, the biggest thing at this time was trying to build Diablo Canyon. And for a whole host of reasons, rates in California were going up. The Diablo Canyon situation didn't help in Northern California, and there was a period of pretty significant recession that was most acutely felt in California. So when you like go through a period like that, everyone's kind of scrutinizing their electric bills, right? And there were businesses that were threatening to leave the state. And that's where, in the 90s, where we get into discussion of California being the first state to quote unquote deregulate, right? In an effort to introduce competition among within the generation sector specifically, in the interest of driving down wholesale costs and therefore retail costs.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue to what I call the deregulation era, which we all know is just restructuring. We get it. We hear you. We get it. I understand. It's a good. I think it does reflect the ethos of the era, which was a desire to deregulate, not just restructure. It was a desire. So get it. It's restructuring. I started this with PURPA as one of the first things, and that was 1978. I think that probably had a lot of impact on California as it did across the industry. But then it's really 1992, the Energy Policy Act, that I think you get to the meat of this. And then I have it closing out, and I just use 2001 Enron, the smartest guys in the room, as like the milestone to close out the deregulation era. And of course, like this part of your book is, if nothing else, the reason to buy it and read it, because I do think you do, especially for us in the Northwest that don't maybe we have a different perspective on this era than California utilities do, and really digging into all the dynamics of the power exchange. What was it called?
Power
Go.
exchange. Yeah.
Yeah, just go. Everything going on here. You do a great job in the book. What do you want to highlight for us?
Oh, I knew I missed something. You mentioned PURPA. That also, it played into higher rates. The utilities went out to contract for these alternative supplies, and without getting too nerdy about it, the contracts were like tied to the expected price of oil, and then the oil prices fell, and then so those contracts appeared to be very expensive when the market dynamic shifted. But so deregulation, definitely a misnomer. People who don't really understand the space are like, oh, the utilities are not regulated anymore. It's like, no, the utilities will always be regulated. For any entity that's moving power around is subject to regulation. But in this case, deregulation of electricity supply, right? So we're trying to create a competitive wholesale market so that anybody who's trying to sell electrons to utility is trying to do so at the lowest possible price. That's the idea. So the problem for the utility companies didn't really fight this in the way that you might think. They kind of saw the writing on the wall, but their contention as the market was being structured in California in the 1990s, there were a series of like crazy complicated regulatory then legislative proceedings. They were like, we need to continue to recoup the costs of the out of the money contracts tied to PURPA, as well as the cost overruns tied to the nuclear plants. So the market was set up in a way that what utility companies, this is going to be a mess, but what utility companies could charge to customers was frozen at a certain level. I think it was like the equivalent of $65 a megawatt hour, if I'm recalling. Couldn't charge more than that. And it was expected.
But could charge that.
Could charge that, but
right.
Not more than that.
Right.
So some that was a cap. It was a cap on retail prices, and the idea was the market was going to be so efficient and amazing that it was going to really result in much lower wholesale prices, and that the company could still continue to charge that higher cap and keep the difference until their bad investment costs were recouped. Worked well for a minute. Wholesale prices were really low at the outset, but then a bunch of, first of all, there was all kinds of issues that created scarcer supplies in the early years of the market, like legitimate legitimate supply issues exacerbated by a bunch of smarties, including Enron traders who gamed the system and deliberately drove up wholesale prices way beyond that cap that the utilities could charge to customers. So then all of a sudden the utilities are taking on a lot of debt. And PG&E, I mean, this all kind of comes to a head when PG&E files for bankruptcy. So it was only one of the three big utilities to do it, but Southern California Edison was in pretty dire straits too for a bit. So really consequential. It was like a very peculiar market design, and so it didn't take long for some of these the smartest guys in the room, so to speak, to figure out some of the issues and the loopholes that they could exploit to make quite a bit of money off the backs of the utilities. And it was a total mess. It was a total mess with lasting implications for the way wholesale power markets are designed for PG&E specifically. Yeah, and it took several years off my life to write this chapter, so I'm glad that you enjoyed it so much. It made it worthwhile.
It is not a simple story to tell, but I think it is the best overview of what happened in that time that I have read. And for me, it's living history because I started working for the Bonneville Power Administration in 1991. And then I was in Washington, D.C. when we went through this power crisis. So it was just, like I said, a really great overview. And I recommend people read, if nothing else, in that part of the book, they read that part.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that.
They should read the whole thing.
They should. Okay, so I'm back. I lost you. I'm sure you continued on with a great conversation. I am back. I mapped this to the Speak Now album by Taylor Swift. Any commentary on whether I chose right with Speak Now? Sparks Fly, great. It's great for a song, also just great for the electric sector. Yeah. Mine, Better Than Revenge. What do you think?
Yeah, I can see that. This took a lot of thinking, Paul. I'm impressed.
Thank you for affirming me. I do appreciate the affirmation for sure. Better Than Revenge felt really good to close out this to like mirror the Enron. That there was going to be some Better Than Revenge by regulators after the power crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's Better Than Revenge too. Is it partially that Enron collapsed of problems of its own making? But... Yes,
exactly. That is Better Than Revenge.
Okay.
Yeah.
After the so this is at the end of the deregulation era, the precipitating event is the crisis, the power crisis. That starts in my mapping the power crisis era. Midnights is just right there. Midnights is right there for us to just embrace as the anthem of this era. Anti-hero. Sleepless Nights, Anti-Hero being a great like anthem for the crisis. You're on Your Own, Kid. This is the longest list of songs from any album that I included because it is the perfect album for this era. Karma, Bejeweled. I did also get some commentary from my wife and my daughter about how I ordered this from the original ordering. Decided to end with Karma for the 2005 Energy Policy Act. Right. But can you talk, like we already talked a lot about the power crisis and how that impacted, but can you talk about bankruptcies, what bankruptcy meant for California and how that had lasting effects in other areas for Pacific Gas and Electric?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a really big deal when a utility goes bankrupt, right? I mean, they're basically guaranteed the ability to not only collect revenue, but to make a profit. And so it's kind of exceedingly rare to see a utility bankruptcy and a bankruptcy the size of PG&E. I mean, that like jeopardizes like to have a utility in such financial straits is like a huge risk to the the entire California economy, right? So this became quickly a very political issue. And because, I mean, you want to be simply put, it's like you need to have a financially stable utility with proper access to capital in order to not only operate the system well, but to continue to sort of like do the build out and everything that is necessary to support whatever economic growth, Yeah. So I mean, like
deliver on the Insul promise. Deliver on the Insul promise. You need
promise.
low cost capital and economies of scale.
Yeah. And so that was a very big deal. And like I didn't really get into the whole ins and outs of the first bankruptcy in the book because I think it's much more important to focus on what it meant for the company afterwards. In my mind, the biggest and most important consequence was it comes out with this directive from the top when they kind of came under new leadership upon emergence that like we are going to be a really attractive utility to Wall Street, right? We're gonna invest a bunch of capital. We're gonna do big things on which we're gonna earn a return. We're gonna transform our business to be more efficient. This is the era of business transformation, and it was literally called business transformation. They brought a bunch of consultants in to be like figure out where they could make their processes better or like where they could reduce spending. And the consultants had no idea what they were looking at, but they were like, you seem to have really bad records and we don't really know which way is up, but why don't you slash $100 million out of this budget? They're like, great. And then the whole thing was like a total disaster. But as part of this, you begin to see decision-making over many years in which every year, little by little, they're taking some money out of like, the inspection budget for inspecting gas transmission pipelines, the inspection budget for inspecting transmission lines. I'm sure they batted back and forth the vegetation management budget a bunch of times, and so like really jeopardizing the thoroughness and effectiveness of those specific programs because these are not the big capital investments on which they earn a return. This is O&M money that comes right out of the bottom line, right? So they were really doing a lot to try to reestablish themselves as this like super attractive utility investment until they weren't, right? Until everything fell apart. But that's further on down the road.
Yeah. So can you map the business transformation era? That's this knock-on effect after the power crisis. So that was like the 2000s, mid 2000s.
It was like 2005 to roughly 2009.
Yeah. So that maps for me like the energy independence era. And I think talking about how that business transformation was happening in this period of the shale gas revolution and the big investment in renewables, especially in California, to be energy independent, to invest, because this is part of, we talked about this, I think separately, not yet, we haven't talked about this, but the investment in renewables happened at this time, right? It was part of the deploying capital for renewables in California. Did that happen here?
Yeah,
or was that a little bit later?
No, it totally was. It was around the same time that you began to see California set these increasingly ambitious targets. The other consequence of the deregulation effort in California was that utilities were no longer going to own generation for the most part, right? They sold off most of their gas plants during this. They still kept hydro and nuclear, but that meant that in order to achieve these goals, the companies PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E were going to go out and still do to this day, contract for new wind and solar resources with developers. So they weren't necessarily deploying capital in the traditional utility sense. They're just spending a lot of money on contracts, and that too is a pass-through cost.
And really, did that mean that in order to get those returns and for earnings, it was really a cost-cutting measure? Because the only mechanisms for getting an increased return were transmission and cutting costs. Is that fair?
I mean, like any sort of capital project, right, on which that adds to the overall value of the rate base. So they have to find certain ways to deploy that capital in order to make a return. And certainly though, freeing up money by cutting some of those pass-through costs, whether it be O&M or, I mean, they didn't really have much of a choice as it related to the renewable energy contracts. Those were just expensive, period. And they had to procure by state law. So it had sort of the renewable stuff, the early renewables contracts had the unfortunate effect of playing pretty substantially into rates, which is yet another reason why they were looking to make certain cuts to try to reduce rate pressure.
Well, I mapped this to the Reputation album for Taylor Swift. In this period, one of the big milestones is the Great Recession.
Yep.
And then the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which does kind of codify a lot of the production tax credit for renewable resources that help spur later. This is why we can't have nice things is I think a good song for that type of era and that milestone, the Great Recession. Endgame being the starting anthem for this era and closing out with Look What You Made Me Do. To map. So I include this is controversy, and we should talk about this. I think of the Inflation Reduction Act as maybe the ending or inflection point of the energy independence era. The Inflation Reduction Act is very much an investment in onshoring infrastructure and deploying energy infrastructure for the electric sector. And I think of that as part of the energy independence era. But it's also a nexus to the next era. So to me, it's like a breaking point. And there's an argument there that regulation largely lags. So maybe the energy independence era ended sooner, like in 2020, maybe.
Yeah.
Would be a good one. What do you think of Reputation as the album?
Works for me.
Crystal, any takes on Reputation as the album?
I love how you end it with Look What You Made Me Do.
I think that's the best of the bunch.
I'll take it. Okay, so this is my thesis, and a good place to we're going to start closing it out because my thesis is that we do hit this next era, and we're too near the next era, which I call the global era, to really see it yet and maybe be able to identify the exact milestone. It could be like March 2020 is the milestone. But the global era, I think, starts at least in the energy sector with LNG exports and the increased amount of LNG exports that kind of ramped up in 2018, 2019, that were kind of the market reaction to really low natural gas prices as a result of the shale gas revolution. But then this era is marked by the global pandemic. It's also marked by global warming and that impact on electric utilities. Also marked by, and this is all global trends, right? The cyber warfare and targeted attacks on energy infrastructure. What was the natural gas pipeline that was held hostage a couple years ago?
Oh,
remember
yeah.
that?
Yep, I do. I don't remember the name of the pipeline, but
I don't either.
remember it.
So to me, that's one of that's kind of, these are all like global factors and how our energy infrastructure in the US and electricity, which has been insulated from global pressures a lot in its history, is
Right.
now impacted. And I mapped this to red. I knew you were trouble when you walked in, I think is a great way to oh man, when the pandemic hit, I knew you were trouble when you walked in. And closing with Ed Sheeran, Everything Has Changed. This feels like a good to this whole electric sector. Eras of the electric sector is a good way. Yeah, they get back
Yeah.
there. And then Crystal, I'll hand it to you on the other album or other song from this album as a good song to reflect this whole changing dynamic.
Yeah, I think I said it in our earlier segment on with Catherine, but at least for Oregon and Washington, California, West Coast, we are never, ever getting back together with coal. So I think it's, very appropriate.
And in your book, the global warming era is probably the most interesting or most impactful for Pacific Gas and Electric when it comes to your story. But the bark beetle and drought, can you talk about how this whether you think global warming era is a good era breaking point and what's going on at Pacific Gas and Electric now?
Oh yeah. This is very central reason why it's facing such challenging circumstances. So historically, fire risk, well, not now, but historically, fire risk was most acute in Southern California, especially in the autumn with onshore winds and making it so that the risk of fire spread is much greater. There was a really devastating fire in 2007 in San Diego Gas and Electric Service Territory when a power line ignited this massive fire that killed a bunch of firefighters. it was sort of that company's wake-up call, as well as a wake-up call for the California Public Utilities Commission as to whether utilities needed to do more to address wildfire risk. Very plodding, bureaucratic proceeding results. And PG&E, I mean, for several years this goes on, which isn't any surprise given the pace of regulatory processes. And come 2011, as this debate is still going on, Northern California is on fire, mostly as a result of lightning strikes. But there was actually the entire state is on fire, but including a lot of the forests in Northern California, demonstrating the fact that they were becoming much less healthy than they were, partially as a result of some periods of very severe drought that invites these bark beetles that feast on trees that have been deprived of water. And PG&E, though, is, despite the fact that this is literally happening in its own backyard, argues to the PUC that it shouldn't be required to do more to address fire risk, because historically fire risk hasn't been as high in Northern California. That's a Southern California problem. Very much a missed opportunity for both the company and the PUC in trying to take a look at this and be like, because, I mean, obviously action is expensive, not as much as inaction, as we've seen. But yep. The PUC agreed with PG&E and said, you don't need to do your formal fire plan. Only the Southern California utilities have to do that. So they got started in earnest in hardening their systems way earlier than PG&E did. And so then you begin to see the drought and the bark beetle infestation just get worse. There's a 2015 fire called the Butte Fire that ignited when a tree fell on a PG&E power line. A couple of people died. I mean, even that wasn't really enough of a wake-up call. In 2017, there was about 18 wildfires that ignited when trees collided with PG&E power lines in mostly wine country area. 22 people died as a result of fires that were definitely caused by PG&E's power lines. There's the second fire, a large fire, the one in Santa Rosa, killed an additional 22 people. It has been debated as to what the cause of that fire was, but PG&E ultimately included those victims in a settlement. And then in 2018, the old transmission wire that we've been talking about in other areas of the program here fell and ignited the campfire that killed 84 people. And so as a result of these disasters, collectively, the company estimated it owed $30 billion and filed for bankruptcy, kicking off yet another massive scramble at the state level to try to get this company out of bankruptcy, because this bankruptcy was even more consequential for the state because it was obvious how much work needed to be done to address risk. People had lost thousands of homes. I mean, more than 100 people dead. There needed to be, was hoping to be quick resolution for compensation. I mean, all kinds of different stuff. And PG&E ultimately pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter for its role in the campfire, which was really, frankly, just a stunning admitting to reckless negligence of operating the transmission lines. And now, under new leadership, they're trying to invest billions of dollars to put part of the system underground, the parts at highest risk of starting fires. So it's really this drought and climate change issue combined with systemic mismanagement had created enormous risk that was underappreciated both within the company and the PUC, and kicked off a very urgent scramble, first to get out of bankruptcy and then to sort of play catch up on these risks that have been occurring for years.
Yeah, a great way. I know you have to go shortly, so a great way to kind of close out this whole discussion about Pacific Gas and Electric in your book, about it being a cautionary tale, and articulating action is expensive, but inaction is way more expensive.
Absolutely.
And these are tragedies that were foreseeable. So thank you. The book is California Burning: The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and What It Means for America's Power Grid. I have appreciated everything. I have a playlist. You should listen to it. It's a great. Just listen to Taylor Swift. There's nothing wrong with that.
Can't wait.
I hope you feel valued and appreciated. I hope this was a fun experience for you.
Super fun. It's a blast. I'm going to go turn on that playlist now.
Perfect. Crystal, thank you for doing this. I should say Crystal's notes helped inform these slides. Thank you for putting together the notes, Crystal.
Thank you, Paul. You're so clever. And I learned so much from reading this book. Thank you for the book. And thanks for your reporting.
Yeah, of course. No, thanks for taking the time to talk about it, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And we'll close it there. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without end.
Thanks to Crystal Ball and Katherine Blunt for joining me on my tour, my Eras of the Electric Sector tour. Just to review, I had mapped the Insel era to the Taylor Swift self-titled album released in 2006, the electrification era of the electric sector to the Fearless album, the efficiency era to Folklore, the deregulation era of the electric sector to Speak Now album and the Speak Now era, the Power Crisis era, of course, to Midnights, with a great number of songs from that album being represented on the Spotify playlist that's available with the episode that goes through the songs of the eras. And you can hear through the changing albums and the changing themes of the albums, the changes to the electric sector. Next, I had the Energy Independence era mapped to the Reputation album. And lastly, the current era, the global era, the global warming era, mapped to the Red album. You can find that all on Spotify playlist. It's even got a nice little shield with the logo representing all of the albums and all of the logos and symbols for the various eras of Taylor Swift. In the next episode, or this is a bonus episode, so you'll be able to hear back from Conley, Farhad, and Almaz in the next episode, so please subscribe. Special thanks to today's presenting sponsor, the Energy Authority, for making this show possible. If you want to feel seen, heard, try tea. To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Roll on, enthusiasts, roll on. Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are our own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, S&P Global, News Data, or the organization of the guests, also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Crystal Ball and Paul Dockery, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiasts, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with the energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other energy enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.